I never thought I'd end up here questioning everything I believed about love, trust, and family. But it didn't happen all at once. It started small, quiet, almost invisible. After the divorce, it was just my dad and me. My mom left, and honestly, I don't even blame her anymore. I mean, how do you stay when something feels so broken? Even after she left, I didn't feel like I'd lost everything. I still had him. We made it through the hard parts together. The long nights when the house felt too big. The awkward dinners when neither of us knew what to say. We even had our little ritual. Every Friday we'd pick a movie, pile up on the couch, and forget about the rest of the world for a while. It was our thing. First, it was just about distraction. Movies were safe. We didn't have to talk about the divorce or my mom, or how different everything felt. We could just sit there sharing popcorn, pretending we weren't sad. But after a while it became more than that. It was comforting, familiar. It made me feel like nothing had really changed, even though I knew it had. My dad always made sure I felt safe. He'd tuck me under a blanket or let me pick the movie, even if it was something he hated. He never complained. I guess I started leaning on him more than I should have. I don't think I even realized it at the time, but I needed him. Not just as a parent, but as someone who made me feel like I mattered. I didn't have that anywhere else. My friends at school talked about crushes and parties, and I pretended to care, but inside I felt disconnected. As if I were floating through life while everyone else figured things out. With my dad, though, I felt grounded. He was always there, and that meant more than I ever told him. I remember the first time I noticed something felt off. We were watching a movie in his room because the TV in the living room was broken. It wasn't weird at first. We'd sat next to each other a million times. But that night the room felt smaller. Or maybe I just felt smaller. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. How close we were. Or how quiet it got when the movie was over. I hated myself for even thinking about it, for noticing something I shouldn't have. But once the thought was there, I couldn't make it go away. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was just in my head. For a while I wanted to believe that because the truth, it scared me. After that night, I began questioning everything. Every hug, every laugh. Every time he looked at me a little too long or asked if I was okay when I hadn't said anything. I didn't want to think about it. I wanted things to go back to how they were before I noticed. But you can't unsee things. I started to wonder if he noticed it too. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I needed him too much. I let myself get too close because I didn't have anyone else. And maybe he just wanted to protect me. Maybe that was all it was. But even now I'm not sure, and that uncertainty hurts the most. I don't know if I imagined it or if it was real. I didn't think I truly realized how lonely I was until it was too late. After my mom left, the house felt emptier, even with my dad there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just her. It was the way things used to feel normal, whole. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it didn't matter. Plenty of kids grow up with one parent. But the truth is, I felt abandoned, not just by my mom, but by everything I thought my life was supposed to be. And that's when I started holding on to my dad harder than I should have. First, it didn't seem like a big deal. We talked more about school, my friends, how I felt about the divorce. He listened in a way no one else did. He actually cared, and when I cried, he didn't tell me to stop. I just fell apart in his arms. I thought I needed that. Someone who wouldn't leave, someone who made me feel like I wasn't too much, too emotional, too needy, too broken. But looking back, I can see how the lines began to blur. How I started to depend on him in ways that probably weren't fair to either of us. I didn't just crave his attention, I needed it. And the more he gave, the more I craved. We'd have these late-night conversations long after the movie ended, where I'd spill out everything, my fears, my regrets, my insecurities, and he'd tell me it was okay, that I wasn't alone, that he'd always be there. Maybe that's why I stopped seeing him as just my dad. He felt more than that. He felt safe, and safety was something I hadn't felt in a long time. I hate how desperate I must have seemed, how I let myself cling to him like that. But I didn't know how to stop. I wrapped myself up in his attention and pretended it was enough to make me feel normal again. And the worst part? It worked for a while anyway. I felt wanted, important, like I mattered to someone. When he told me he was proud or hugged me a little tighter than usual, I soaked it all in. I told myself it was just a dad loving his daughter. That's what I wanted to believe, that's what I needed to believe. But deep down, I knew I was walking a line I shouldn't have been. I wasn't blind. I saw the way his eyes lingered sometimes, The way he'd brush my hair out of my face and let his hand stay there a second too long. I made excuses for it. He was just being protective or affectionate, or trying to make up for Mom leaving. Maybe all of that was true. Maybe it wasn't. I still don't know. But what I do know is that I didn't stop. I didn't pull away or set boundaries. I leaned in because I wanted to feel loved, even if it wasn't the way it was supposed to be. And maybe that's why I blame myself as much as I blame him. I used to think I was strong, independent. But sitting there with my dad, feeling his arm around me, hearing him say he'd always take care of me, I realized how fragile I really was. I wasn't as grown up as I wanted to be. I was still a kid trying to fill a hole that felt too big to handle. And I let myself believe that the closeness we shared, the closeness I craved, was harmless. But it wasn't. No matter how much I tried to rewrite that part of my story, it doesn't change what happened next. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. I know it's not an easy story to hear, and I appreciate you listening. If you find this interesting or if you think there's someone who can relate to what I'm sharing, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps me keep sharing stories like this. And I know I'm not alone out here. Alright, let's get back to it. That night didn't feel different at first. It started like every other Friday, just me and my dad in his room, picking out a movie. It was our routine, safe, predictable. But looking back, I can see the cracks, the little moments that should have made me stop and question things. I didn't, though I wished I could. I remember sitting as close as always, my head resting against his shoulder, my legs tucked under me. It wasn't unusual, it felt normal. But somewhere between the opening credits and the halfway mark, I noticed a heavy silence. Not the kind that falls when a movie gets serious, but the kind that felt almost physical, as if everyone was waiting for someone to speak up. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading into details because my mind wouldn't shut up. Yet, the longer we sat there, the harder it was to ignore the way he shifted slightly but didn't move away. The way his breathing slowed as if he suddenly became aware of just how close we were. I felt it too, that tension, that quiet pull that twisted my stomach. And for the first time I didn't feel safe. Not in the way I was used to. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something else, something I didn't want to name. I should have said something. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I just sat there pretending I couldn't feel the shift, pretending everything was fine. Even though it wasn't. At one point my dad's hand brushed against my arm. It wasn't intentional, or at least I hope it wasn't, but the second it happened my whole body tensed. Instead of pulling away, I froze. I stayed there trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. But it did. It meant something even if I didn't want it to. I don't know how long I sat like that. Stiff, uncomfortable, trapped in my own head. I wanted to get up, to make an excuse and leave the room, but I didn't want him to notice. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting. So I stayed. I stayed because I couldn't bear to ruin the one thing that still felt normal in my life. Later, I would regret letting it happen, for not doing something before it got worse. But in that moment, all I could do was sit there and pretend nothing had changed, even though everything had. Maybe that's the part that still haunts me. The pretending, the way I let myself believe it was all in my head because facing the truth was too hard. I've replayed that night in my mind countless times, analyzing every glance, every touch, every word left unsaid. The more I think about it, the more I realize how much I missed. It wasn't just that night. It was the weeks leading up to it, the way we started sitting closer, talking longer, sharing things we probably shouldn't have. The lines had been blurring for a while. I either didn't want to see it or maybe I saw it and didn't care. Maybe I liked the attention too much to push it away. And that hurts the most, not knowing whether I let it happen on purpose. I've read about how people from broken families sometimes form unhealthy attachments, how loneliness can make you cling to someone in ways you shouldn't. Knowing that doesn't make it any easier to live with the guilt, the shame, and the endless questions that keep me up at night. Was it my fault? Did I misread the signs? Or did I ignore them because I didn't want to lose the one person who made me feel seen? The way he made me feel like I mattered, that's what I keep coming back to. And maybe that's why I didn't stop it. Maybe I was too scared of what would happen if I did. I wanted him to need me as much as I needed him, and once I realized that, everything else started to make sense. But making sense of something doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't make it hurt any less. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. After the movie ended, I went back to my room, shut the door and sat there in the dark. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and my thoughts spun relentlessly. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal, that I was overreacting, but no matter how many times I repeated it, it didn't feel true. I replayed every look, every moment when the air felt heavy between us. I tried to rationalize it, but the more I thought, the worse it got. It was like my mind wouldn't let me forget. I felt disgusting, not because of what happened, but because I let it happen. I didn't stop it because some part of me didn't want to. And that, more than anything, hurts the most. I didn't tell anyone about that night. Not then, not for a long time. I didn't even write it down because seeing it in black and white would have made it real, and I wasn't ready to face that truth. I thought about telling Mom, but what would she say? She'd left, she'd moved on. I doubted she'd believe me anyway. And even if she did, what could she do? Nothing. And my friends? They never saw this side of me. They only saw the girl who laughed at their jokes, who pretended everything was fine. I couldn't let them see how broken I truly was. So I swallowed it down, buried it deep. But it never went away. It just simmered under the surface, waiting to come out. I started second-guessing everything. Every word, every glance, every hug. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I imagining it? Was I making it bigger than it was? Or was it exactly as it felt? I didn't trust myself. And the more I questioned my feelings, the harder it became to be around him. Yet I couldn't stay away. I needed him too much, and that scared me more than anything. I told myself it wasn't his fault, that he didn't mean to make me feel this way, that I'd messed everything up by getting too attached. But the guilt didn't stop, nor did the confusion. I began to pull away gradually. I stopped sitting so close, stopped talking as much, stopped staying up late in his room. And I could tell he noticed. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the distance, the way he looked at me like he couldn't understand what had changed. How do you tell someone you're scared of something you can't even name? How do you admit that the person meant to protect you is also the one who makes you feel the most vulnerable? I couldn't, so I stayed silent. But secrets don't stay buried forever. They eat at you slowly until nothing's left. I began feeling anxious all the time, as if something terrible was about to happen even when everything seemed fine. I stopped sleeping well, stopped eating as much, stopped feeling like myself. And the worst part? No one noticed. Not Dad, not my friends, not my teachers. I was falling apart and no one could see it. I don't know if it would have been different if I had spoken up. Maybe if I had spoken up sooner, nothing would have changed. Or maybe it would have saved me from everything that came after. I'll never know, and that's something I have to live with. What I do know is this. Emotional lines are easy to cross when you're lonely, and once you cross them you can't go back. You can't unfeel it, unsee it, or pretend it never happened. I've thought a lot about boundaries since then, about how fragile they are, how easily they slip away when you're desperate for connection, and how hard it is to rebuild them once they're broken. I didn't want to lose my dad, and maybe that's why I let things go further than they should have. I wanted to hold on to what we had, even if it wasn't healthy, even if it hurt me. But the truth is, real love isn't supposed to blur lines or break boundaries. Love shouldn't leave you feeling small, scared, or embarrassed. It's meant to make you feel safe. And what I felt that night, well, that wasn't love. It took me a long time to say the word love out loud, longer than I'd like to admit. I'd rehearsed the conversation 100 times in my head, but every version felt wrong. Too angry, too soft, too broken. Maybe that was because I didn't know what I wanted from him. An apology, an explanation, or simply proof that I hadn't imagined it all. But I couldn't carry the silence, the shame, and the weight any longer. I needed to let it out, even if it shattered what little we had left. So one night I sat him down, no movie, no distractions, just us. Before I even opened my mouth, I saw it in his face. He knew what was coming. My words came out shaky at first as I told him how that night had made me feel. Confused, scared, ashamed, and how I had spent months questioning myself, wondering if I was the one who'd let it happen. I told him I didn't hate him, but I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened either. For the first time in my life, I saw him break. He didn't deny it or make excuses. He just sat there, eyes red, hands trembling, and repeated, "I'm sorry," over and over again. And as much as I wanted to hate him in that moment, I couldn't because I saw it too. The regret, the guilt, the pain. It hit me then that he'd been carrying his own weight too. I didn't forgive him that night, I couldn't. But it was the first time I allowed myself to see him as more than just my dad. He was human, flawed, and messed up just like me. That's when I realized I couldn't fix him. I could only fix myself. I started therapy the week after our talk. First, I didn't think it would help. I figured I'd just sit there, repeat the same things I'd been telling myself for months, and leave feeling just as lost. But it wasn't like that. The first thing my therapist told me was that what happened wasn't my fault. Hearing someone else say it, someone who didn't know me, who didn't love me, made it feel real. I didn't cause it, I didn't deserve it, and I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Therapy forced me to look at myself in ways I wasn't ready for. I had to face how much I'd relied on my dad for validation, how my loneliness had clouded my judgment and blurred boundaries I should have kept clear. And even though it hurt, it also made me stronger. I learned to set boundaries, not just with my dad, but with everyone in my life. I learned to recognize red flags before they turned into scars, and most importantly, I learned to trust myself again. After that night, my dad and I didn't talk for a while. We both needed space. But slowly we started to rebuild something new, something beneficial. We even went to therapy together a few times. It wasn't easy. There were many tears and hard conversations, but it helped us understand what went wrong, how grief and loneliness had pushed us into a place we never should have been. It didn't erase what happened, nor did it make it okay, but it helped us move forward without pretending it never existed. Looking back, I see how easy it is to lose yourself when you're hurting, how quickly loneliness can make you hold on to the wrong things just so you don't feel empty, and how dangerous it is to ignore the lines meant to keep us safe. I wish I'd seen it sooner. I wish I'd spoken up before it got to that point. But wishing doesn't change the past. All I can do now is learn from it, and hope my story helps someone else do the same. If I could go back, I'd tell that younger version of myself that love isn't supposed to feel confusing. It's not meant to leave you questioning your worth or wondering if you did something wrong. Love is supposed to make you feel safe, and if it doesn't, it's okay to walk away, even if it's from someone you care about. I didn't know that back then, but I know it now. Loneliness doesn't always look like sitting alone in peace. Sometimes, loneliness isn't about being in an empty room. It's sitting right next to someone and still feeling invisible. Sometimes it's reaching for comfort in places you shouldn't, simply because it's easier than admitting how empty you really feel. That's what happened to me. I let my loneliness make decisions for me. I let it blur lines and twist boundaries until I couldn't tell where they were anymore. For a long time, I blamed myself for that. But what I've learned since then is that loneliness isn't just an emotion. It's a warning sign. It's your mind telling you that something's missing, that you need connection, support, a reason to feel grounded. And when you ignore that need or try to fill it with the wrong things, it only gets worse. For me, healing began with admitting the truth, not just to my dad, but to myself. I had to stop pretending I was okay when I wasn't. I had to stop making excuses for the things that hurt me and start facing them instead. Therapy played a huge role in that. It gave me a safe space to talk without judgment, to process what happened without feeling ashamed. But it wasn't just about talking. It was about learning how to trust myself again, rebuilding my confidence, and letting go of the guilt that had weighed me down for so long. I learned that healing also comes from having the right people around you. People who see you, who hear you, and who remind you that you're not alone. Whether that's friends, family, or support groups, it matters because no one gets through this kind of thing alone. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is how important boundaries are. Emotional closeness is a good thing, but only when it's balanced with respect. When you lose that balance, relationships start to feel heavy instead of safe. I learned to set boundaries and stick to them. I learned to listen to that gut feeling that tells you something's off instead of brushing it aside. And most importantly, I learned that it's okay to walk away from people. Even people you love, if being close to them is hurting you. If you're dealing with something like this, don't stay silent. Talk to someone you trust, a friend, a counselor, anyone who will listen without judgment. I know how scary it is to open up about things that feel shameful or complicated, but here's the truth. You're not as alone as you think you are. There are people who will believe you, who will help you find your way back to yourself. Letting them in doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it, growing from it, and taking what hurt you to make you stronger. And that's what I'm still doing every day. Learning, growing, and reminding myself that I'm worth more than the mistakes I've made. If you're struggling right now, know this. You're not broken, you're not unlovable, and you're not alone. Whatever you've been through doesn't define you. You get to decide what comes next. No matter how hard it feels, you can move forward. This isn't just a story about one mistake. It's about how fragile relationships can be, and how easily emotions can spiral out of control when boundaries aren't clear. We don't always recognize the warning signs. Sometimes we're so desperate to feel loved, understood, or seen that we ignore what doesn't feel right. We make excuses and tell ourselves it's nothing, but those little moments add up until we find ourselves somewhere we never thought we'd be. That's why it's so important to step back and really examine the relationships in your life. Are they built on respect and trust? Do they make you feel safe? Or do they leave you questioning yourself? If something feels off, it's okay to speak up, to set boundaries, to walk away if you have to. Protecting your mental and emotional well-being isn't selfish. It's necessary. So ask yourself, when was the last time you truly examined your relationships? Are they giving you what you need? Or are you holding on to something that's hurting you more than it's helping? I didn't ask myself that question soon enough, but you still can. And if nothing else, let this be a lesson. Loneliness can lead you down paths you never expected to take. Don't let yourself drift so far that you can't find your way back. Pay attention before things unravel, because once you cross that line, there's no undoing it. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Your thoughts matter, so feel free to share them.